Listen, the sound of a dying farm isn't a scream. It's a silence so heavy it makes your ears ring. In the spring of 1987, specifically on a Tuesday, when the late April sun was just beginning to bake the frost out of the Nebraska topsoil, Elias Thorne stood by his main irrigation valve and heard nothing but the dry whistle of the wind through the corn stubble. It was the day the city of Lincoln officially severed the line, claiming eminent domain over the aquifer rights that had belonged to the Thorne family since the days of the Homestead Act. Elias wasn't a man given to theatrics, but as he watched the municipal truck kick up dust on its way back to the paved road, he felt a hollowness in his chest that no amount of acreage could fill. The neighbors drove by in their silver-grilled Peterbilts and shiny new John Deeres, slowing down just enough to see the man who'd lost his lifeblood. They didn't stop. In the tight-knit circles of the Great Plains, failure is perceived as a contagious disease, and Elias was suddenly the local leper. His 1978 International Harvester 1086 sat idling in the distance, a massive beast of red iron and turbo whistle, but without the water to turn that dust into gold, it was nothing more than a multi-ton paperweight. He could smell the coming rain of a typical April afternoon, that ozone-heavy promise, but he knew that even a deluge wouldn't save him if the city owned the rights to what lay beneath his boots. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing him down into the dirt, that was rapidly turning into a graveyard for his dreams. His father had told him that a man without water is just a man waiting to be buried. And as the shadows grew long over the thirsty fields, Elias realized he was being buried alive by a bureaucratic pen stroke. The local hardware store was the first place the whispers started. Just as the April winds began to pick up, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth from the farms that still had their permits. Elias walked in to buy a simple replacement gasket for a leaking pump he no longer had the right to turn on. And the silence that greeted him was sharper than a winter frost. Men who had shared coffee with him for 20 years suddenly found the labels on their seed bags incredibly fascinating. They knew the city had won. They knew the Thorne legacy was being auctioned off in their minds before the first legal notice even hit the paper. It was that transition period where the spring thaw should have brought hope, but instead, it brought the realization that the bank would be calling before the first sprouts of May could even break the surface. Elias looked at his hands, calloused, grease-stained, and shaking with a quiet, subterranean rage. He wasn't just losing a business, he was losing his identity. The machinery he loved, the engines he could strip and rebuild in his sleep, they all required the one thing he was being denied. He walked back to his truck, a beat-up Chevy with a rusted bed, and sat there for an hour, watching the heat haze shimmer off the empty irrigation canals. The city council had called it progress, but to Elias, it was a slow-motion execution. He thought about the 3 generations of Thornes who had bled into this soil, and the thought of some developer putting a strip mall over his grandfather's North 40 made his blood boil hotter than a seized-up diesel engine. He didn't have the money for a lawyer, but he had a shovel, a backhoe with a leaking hydraulic line, and a memory of a story his grandfather once told him about a lost vein of the Ogallala Aquifer that the surveyors had missed. The gamble started that night under the pale, indifferent glow of a waning moon. While the rest of the county was tucked away in their beds, dreaming of high yield prices, Elias was out in the back pasture, beneath the skeletal remains of an old windmill that hadn't turned since the dirty 30s. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for a fight. He climbed into the cab of his ancient Case backhoe, the engine groaning as it protested the cold start in the crisp April night. The smell of unburnt diesel hung heavy in the damp night air, a familiar scent that usually brought comfort, but now felt like an omen. He began to dig, not just for water, but for a way to prove the world wrong. Every bucket of earth he turned over felt like a middle finger to the city planners who thought they could erase a man by turning a valve. But as the hours bled into the early morning, and the hole grew deeper without a hint of moisture, the weight of the task began to settle in. He was one man against the earth, armed with nothing but outdated machinery and a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. The mechanical screams of the backhoe echoed off the hills, a lonely sound that told the story of a man who refused to go quietly. He was digging a hole that everyone said would be his own grave, but in his mind, he was excavating the foundation of a comeback that would either make him a millionaire or the town's greatest cautionary tale. By the time the sun started to peek over the horizon, Elias was 20 feet down, surrounded by nothing but dry clay and the cold realization that he might be chasing a ghost. The sun didn't just rise that morning. It exposed the sheer desperation of the crater Elias had carved into the Nebraska panhandle. By 7 o'clock, the dust hadn't even settled when a white dually with the Midstate Equipment logo on the door crunched up the gravel driveway. Out stepped Miller, a man who had sold Elias's father his first combine, but now looked at Elias like a bad debt that needed to be erased from the ledger. Miller didn't even bother with the pleasantries of the season, ignoring the budding lilacs and the crisp morning air that should have heralded a profitable planting cycle. He pointed a meaty finger at the International Harvester 1086 sitting idle by the barn, and told Elias that the grace period on the lease-to-own agreement was officially over. With the city cutting the water, the bank had flagged the Thorne farm as a high-risk liability, and the dealership was moving to repossess the red iron before it could be stripped for parts. Elias stood at the edge of his hole, his clothes caked in dry silt, and his eyes bloodshot from a night of inhaling diesel fumes, and realized the vultures weren't just circling, they were landing. Behind Miller's truck, a flatbed tow rig idled at the gate, its winch cable glinting in the harsh morning light like a hangman's noose. If Elias lost the 1086, he lost his ability to even prep the soil, water or no water. He had exactly 72 hours to show a viable irrigation plan, or the machinery that was the heartbeat of his operation would be hauled off to be auctioned to the highest bidder at the county fairgrounds. The pressure didn't stop with the repo crew. Before Miller had even finished his ultimatum, a second vehicle arrived, a sleek municipal SUV with City of Lincoln emblazoned on the door. A foreman in a crisp polo shirt stepped out, carrying a clipboard that felt heavier than a sledgehammer. He didn't see a farmer trying to save his heritage. He saw a zoning violation in progress. He informed Elias that digging an unpermitted well on land where the water rights had been surrendered was a felony offense, carrying fines that would bankrupt him faster than the drought ever could. The foreman's voice was clinical, devoid of the grit and sweat that built the very roads he drove on. He gave Elias a cease-and-desist order, stating that if the hole wasn't filled by Friday, the sheriff would be out to escort him off the property. The crop risk was now absolute. If the seeds weren't in the ground and hydrated within the next 10 days, the window for the 1987 season would slam shut, and the Thorne name would be struck from the local directories forever. Elias looked from the bureaucrat to the repo man, feeling the walls of his world closing in. His bank account was a desert of zeros. His reputation was a smoldering wreck. And his only ally was a leaking case backhoe that was currently hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid into the very hole he was trying to save his life with. The irony was a bitter pill. He was being sued for digging for the one thing he needed to pay the people suing him. By the time the afternoon heat began to shimmer over the parched fields, the physical toll of the struggle began to manifest in the iron and steel Elias relied on. As he climbed back into the cab of the backhoe, desperate to get another few feet of depth before the sheriff arrived, a high-pitched whine signaled the catastrophic failure of the main hydraulic pump. A spray of hot, black oil geysered out from under the chassis, coating the windshield and Elias's face in a slick, stinging film. He sat there in the sweltering cab, the smell of burnt fluid filling his lungs, and for the first time, he let his head drop against the steering wheel. He was out of time, out of money, and now, out of the only tool he had left to fight back. From the road, he could see the neighbors' trucks slowing down, their drivers watching the spectacle of the Thorne boy finally braking. He could almost hear their conversations at the diner, how he'd finally lost his mind, how he was digging his own grave in the middle of a dry pasture. The debt was a mountain he couldn't climb, and the deadline for the seed was a clock ticking toward zero with every heartbeat. He was standing on the precipice of total ruin, covered in the lifeblood of a dead machine, looking down into a dry pit that mocked his every effort. The town expected him to climb out, shake Miller's hand, and hand over the keys to the International. They expected him to sign the papers and walk away into a life of quiet defeat. But as he wiped the oil from his eyes, Elias saw something in the dark earth at the bottom of the pit. A subtle change in the color of the clay, a hint of something cool and ancient. Elias didn't climb out of that hole. He crawled, the hydraulic oil acting like a second skin that collected every grain of Nebraska dust until he looked more like a golem than a man. The backhoe was dead, a 6-ton monument to his supposed failure. But the clay he'd scraped from the very bottom of the pit was cold, violently, impossibly cold. That wasn't the temperature of the surface. That was the chill of the deep aquifer, protected by a layer of blue shale that the city's fancy geological surveys claimed was impenetrable. He knew then that the water hadn't disappeared. It had just retreated behind a wall of rock that modern high-speed rotary drills couldn't touch without burning out their bits. He needed a weapon from a different era. Dragging his exhausted limbs to the back of the machine shed, he pushed aside a wall of rotted hay bales to reveal the skeleton of a 1940s Bucyrus-Erie 22W cable tool drill rig. It was a rusted, skeletal tower of iron that his grandfather had used to save the farm during the Dust Bowl, a machine designed for one thing: the slow, rhythmic destruction of anything standing between a man and his water. The rig's original Hercules engine was a solid block of rust, but Elias didn't need it to run. He needed the 1086. He spent the next 5 hours in a state of mechanical clairvoyance, his mind mapping out a drive system that shouldn't have worked. He stripped the PTO shaft from a junked manure spreader and began the agonizing process of mating it to the 22W's main drive pulley. He was welding in the dark, the sparks from his stick welder illuminating the shed in jagged bursts of ultraviolet light, fusing together 2 generations of machinery in a desperate, unholy union. The technical hurdle was the bit. A standard drill bit would snap against the blue shale like a toothpick. Elias went to his scrap pile and pulled out the front axle of a 1964 Mack truck, solid, high-carbon steel, forged in an era when things were built to outlast their owners. He spent 2 hours over a grinding wheel, the scream of the stone against the steel filling the night, until the end of that axle was a 4-sided, razor-sharp percussion head. This was the old method, a process of pounding rather than spinning. He backed the International 1086 up to the rig, the red paint of the tractor glowing in the moonlight, and engaged the rear PTO. The tractor's engine pitched down, a heavy, guttural growl that shook the very foundation of the shed as the torque transferred through the improvised shaft. The ancient pulleys of the Bucyrus-Erie began to groan, the heavy cables snapping taut with a sound like a rifle shot. Elias eased the clutch, and the derrick began to dance. Thud, thud, thud. The Mack truck axle bit, weighing nearly half a ton with the added sinker bars, began to drop into the hole, striking the earth with a force that sent tremors through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the fast, efficient hum of a modern rig. It was a violent, primitive assault on the earth. Each strike was a gamble. If the cable snapped, the bit would be lost forever, and the hole would be sealed as surely as if the city had poured concrete down it. But Elias stood at the controls, his hand on the brake lever, feeling the vibrations travel up through the steel and into his marrow. He wasn't just drilling. He was listening to the earth, waiting for the change in pitch that would tell him he'd broken through the shale and into the vein that would either make him a king or leave him a pauper. By the time the moon began to set and the cool night air of late April started to bite through his grease-soaked coveralls, the rhythmic pounding had become a part of the landscape, a heartbeat that the neighbors could hear for miles. The skeptical farmers who had driven by earlier were now pulling their trucks over to the shoulder of the road, watching the silhouette of the old derrick rising like a ghost against the stars. They knew that sound. It was the sound of a man who had stopped caring about the rules and started caring about survival. Elias was bypassing the city's entire infrastructure, cutting through the red tape with 500 pounds of forged steel and the sheer unbridled torque of the 1086. He was ignoring the cease-and-desist orders, the repossession threats, and the cold reality of his bank balance. Every time the bit hit the bottom of the hole, it sent a spray of pulverized rock and dust into the air, a gray mist that coated the red tractor and the man at the helm. He was 30 feet down, then 40, then 50. The Mack axle was holding, but the improvised PTO shaft was starting to twist under the strain, the metal groaning as it approached its breaking point. Elias knew he was redlining the machinery, pushing the 1086's transmission to a place it was never meant to go. If the shaft sheared, it would likely take his leg with it, or worse, whip around and shatter the tractor's rear glass. But he didn't back off the throttle. He pushed it forward, the black smoke from the 1086's stack billowing into the night air, a signal fire for anyone who thought the Thorne farm was ready to be buried. He was 100 feet deep when the sound changed. A wet, hollow schloop followed the strike instead of the sharp crack of stone. The derrick lurched, the cable went slack for a split second, and the engine of the 1086 suddenly revved free as the resistance vanished. Elias froze, his hand trembling on the lever, his heart hammering against his ribs harder than the drill bit ever could. The silence that followed the breakthrough was more terrifying than the noise. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he'd snapped the cable and dropped the Mac axle bit into a bottomless void, a final mechanical betrayal that would seal his fate. But then, the 1086's exhaust stack let out a sharp bark as the governor kicked in, sensing a new, heavy resistance. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the drill line, a sound like a distant freight train coming up through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the sound of rock or clay, it was the sound of a subterranean giant waking up. Suddenly, a plume of gray slurry shot 30 feet into the air, drenching the derrick and the front of the International in a cocktail of pulverized shale and ancient, ice-cold water. The pressure was immense, far greater than any municipal pump could ever dream of producing. As the first light of a Friday morning began to bleed over the horizon, the road was already lined with the trucks of neighbors who had stayed up all night to watch the Thorne family's final stand. They saw the spray first, a silver geyser catching the dawn, and the word spread through the county like a brush fire. Elias Thorne hadn't just found water, he'd tapped into a pressurized, virgin vein of the Ogallala that wasn't supposed to exist on this side of the county line. He stood in the middle of the deluge, his arms raised, the oil and dust being washed away by a torrent that tasted like victory and felt like iron. The celebration was short-lived, as the white dually and the city's SUV roared back into the yard, followed closely by the local sheriff's cruiser, its lights painting the wet barn in flashes of red and blue. Miller, the repo man, jumped out with a set of heavy chains, his face twisted in a mask of professional coldness, determined to take the 1086 before the situation got any more complicated. The city foreman was right behind him, shouting about environmental hazards and unpermitted discharge, waving his clipboard like a shield against the reality of the geyser. But as they approached the rig, the sheriff stepped out of his car and stopped dead. He wasn't looking at the paperwork, he was looking at the neighbors who had stepped out of their trucks and were now walking into Elias's field. Old Man Henderson, who owned 3,000 acres to the south, and the Miller brothers, who ran the local elevator, stood in a silent semicircle around the drill rig. They didn't say a word, but the message was clear. The time for legal technicalities had passed. This wasn't just Elias's water anymore. This was the proof that the land still had secrets the city couldn't buy. The foreman started to scream about the cease and desist, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the water and the guttural, defiant idle of the International harvester. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. The man they had come to bury was now the only man in the county with a surplus of the one thing everyone else was praying for. Miller hesitated, the heavy chains dragging in the mud. He looked at the 1086, then at the wall of farmers, and finally at Elias, who was leaning against the tractor's mud-caked tire with a look of calm that was more intimidating than any rage. The repo man knew that if he hooked that tractor now, he wouldn't just be taking a machine. He'd be inciting a riot among the very people who kept his dealership in business. The sheriff, a man who had grown up in these fields, tucked his hat lower and walked over to the city foreman. He didn't arrest Elias. Instead, he pointed to the geyser and told the foreman that if he didn't get off the property and find a way to make this legal within the hour, he'd be the one facing a public disturbance charge. The neighbors began to cheer, a raw, guttural sound that echoed the roar of the well. For the first time in years, the Thorne farm wasn't a place of desperation. It was a beacon. The city had tried to starve Elias out, to turn his heritage into a suburb, but he had reached down into the dark and pulled out a fortune that no bank could repossess. As the city officials retreated and Miller backed his tow rig down the drive, Elias looked at the 1086, the red iron dripping with water and grease, and realized the technical pivot hadn't just saved his farm, it had redefined the map of the entire county. He was no longer the man who lost his water. He was the man who owned the source. The legal fallout from that Friday morning breakthrough didn't just stay in the county. It rippled all the way to the state Supreme Court. But Elias had already won the war before the first subpoena was served. The city's legal team, realizing they had illegally encroached on a protected artesian pocket documented in a 19th century survey they'd ignored, was forced into a massive out-of-court settlement that cleared Elias's debts in a single afternoon. But the real wealth didn't come from a courtroom check. It came from the sky falling silent during the historic drought of 1988. While the rest of the Midwest saw their corn curl and die under a merciless sun, the Thorne farm was a lush emerald sanctuary, fed by a well that never quit and a pressure system that required no electricity to run. Elias became the primary water supplier for 3 surrounding counties, selling his excess flow to the very municipal districts that had tried to shut him down. But he did it on his terms, at a price that ensured no small farmer in the valley would ever go thirsty again. He transformed the old machine shed into a state-of-the-art bottling facility for Thorne Deep Well mineral water, a brand that eventually caught the eye of a national distributor. Within 5 years of that desperate night with the backhoe, the man who had been 1 day away from a repo man's chain was sitting on a portfolio worth millions. But you wouldn't know it by looking at him. He still wore the same grease-stained cap, and he still spent his Saturday mornings in the seat of that International 1086, which he'd restored to a showroom shine that could be seen from the interstate. The technical pivot from a modern high-speed drill to a primitive cable tool rig became a case study in local engineering colleges, a reminder that sometimes the new ways are just expensive ways of being wrong. Elias's improvised Mack truck axle bit is now a permanent fixture on his mantle, a rusted piece of iron that serves as a reminder of the night he refused to let a bureaucrat's pen stroke erase his grandfather's sweat. The neighbors who once turned their heads in shame now line up at his gate, not just for the water, but for the wisdom of a man who looked at a dry hole and saw a future. The Thorne legacy wasn't just saved, it was reinforced with steel and artesian pressure, proving that a man's worth isn't measured by his water rights, but by the depth of his resolve when the world tries to parch him out. The 1086 remains the heart of the operation, a reminder that even when the world moves on to plastic parts and computer chips, there will always be a place for heavy red iron, and a man with the guts to use it. He didn't just dig a well. He excavated the truth about self-reliance in an age of dependency. Today, the Thorne estate stands as a fortress against progress for progress' sake, a place where the water runs cold, the engines run loud, and the word of a Thorne is as solid as the blue shale he broke through. It's a lesson in the power of the old ways, a testament to the fact that when they tell you the well is dry, they might just be afraid of how deep you're willing to dig to find the truth. The emotional closure came on a quiet evening in late October, years after the million-dollar checks had cleared and the headlines had faded into local lore. Elias stood by the original wellhead, the one the city had capped back in 1987, and felt no bitterness, only a profound sense of stewardship. He had taken the humiliation of that spring and forged it into a shield for his community, ensuring that the land would stay in agricultural hands for another century. He looked out over the valley, seeing the lights of the neighboring farms that would have been suburban sprawl by now if it weren't for the water he shared. He realized that the city hadn't taken his rights. They had accidentally given him the ultimate opportunity to prove who he was. He had turned a mechanical failure into a technical masterpiece, and a public reversal into a private victory that echoed through the hills. The machines he loved were no longer just tools. They were the guardians of a way of life that the rest of the world had forgotten. As he climbed back into the cab of the 1086, the smell of clean diesel and fresh water filling the air, he knew he had done more than just become a millionaire. He had become the man his grandfather always said he could be, the one who keeps the water flowing when everyone else has given up on the rain. It wasn't the money that made him sleep well at night. It was the knowledge that as long as there was iron in the shed and a bit in the ground, the Thorne name would never be thirsty again. If you had the choice between following the law and saving your family's legacy, which one would you choose? Let us know in the comments if you think Elias went too far, or if he's exactly what this country needs more of.